We ended the last lecture module with a discussion of the arguments on Paper's thesis. In this lecture module, we'll turn our attention to the Alford thought experiment. Kornblith claims that the Alford thought experiment demonstrates that the arguments on Paper's thesis is false, and does so in a way that mandates the adoption of process theories like the causal theory. Strictly speaking, the Alford thought experiment probably only establishes that the arguments on Paper's thesis, in and of itself, doesn't specify sufficient conditions for justification. Having refuted the arguments on Paper's thesis, Kornblith turns his attention to divining the insights of foundationalism and coherence theory for the purposes of formulating his grand synthesis theory. He reinterprets the regress argument as one that establishes temporal and causal dependence constraints on process theories of justification. Having extracted an insight from foundationalism, he turns his attention to coherence theory and the Moe and Joe thought experiment. He suggests that the Moe and Joe thought experiment shows that the coherence theorist is correct in supposing that background beliefs can play an important role in justification, even in cases of perceptual belief formation. He suggests that he can accommodate this by introducing the notion of relevant alternatives that are introduced by a person's beliefs. At this point, he formulates his grand synthesis theory of justification, a reliable process theory. Let's turn our attention now to the Alford thought experiment. Recall that Kornblith claims that the Alford thought experiment demonstrates that the arguments on Paper's thesis is false. He says, consider the following scenario. Alford, a young man, believes the proposition P justifiably. And Alford also justifiably believes the conditional proposition if P then Q. And Alford believes Q. Surely, Kornblith says, according to the arguments on Paper's thesis, Alford's belief in Q is eminently justified. After all, there's a deductive argument from two justified beliefs in Alford's belief corpus to the conclusion that Q. Therefore, Alford must be justified in believing Q. However, Kornblith notes, Alford did not form his belief in Q on the basis of his knowledge of modus ponens and his belief in P, together with the conditional statement if P then Q. Instead, Alford formed his belief in Q on the basis of his discussion with a one-eyed psychic on the Venice boardwalk the other day. Surely, Kornblith says, the prediction of the arguments on Paper's thesis, that is, that Alford's belief in Q is justified, cannot be true. Surely, it's relevant how Alford actually formed his belief and not the mere evidential relationships between that belief and other beliefs that Alford does have in his belief corpus. What then ought we to take away from the Alford case? Kornblith suggests that if we accept that the problem is that Alford's belief that Q doesn't depend in the right way on his beliefs that P and if P then Q, then we commit ourselves to being process theorists. An internalist might not follow Kornblith in this line of thought. After all, the arguments on Paper's thesis might merely specify a set of necessary but not sufficient conditions for justification. Cases like the Alford case might well be handled by warrant clauses that rule out such frivolous belief formation. Once we're process theorists, Kornblith claims, we can accept the causal dependence result. That is, we can become tentative foundationalists about the justificational and causal history of our beliefs. Beliefs are causally dependent upon one another as part of their justificatory relationships, and those causal dependencies must ultimately result in some beliefs being terminal, being original beliefs having no other causes. We can determine this based on our modified regress argument. In other words, every causal chain ending in a belief has a temporal beginning, and every justificational regress, therefore, has an ending. Kornblith next directs our attention to the Moe and Joe thought experiment. Moe and Joe look at a fruit bowl. Identical psychological processes cause both to believe that there is an apple in front of them. Despite a belief that he is myopic and unable to discriminate between a basket of fruit and a basket of artificial fruit, Joe still believes that he's looking at a genuine apple. Moe also believes that he's looking at a genuine apple, but has no belief that he is myopic. The difference between Moe and Joe, Kornblith suggests, is the difference that is relevant to their justification. Joe does not seem justified given his belief in his myopia, whereas Moe, who has no such belief, does seem justified. This, Kornblith suggests, is the insight that the coherentist has given us. We can accommodate the coherentist insight by suggesting that background beliefs introduce relevant alternatives for assessing the reliability of our belief-forming processes. In other words, background beliefs will introduce ways the world could be. Each way the world could be must be factored into our justificatory evaluation of the reliability of our belief-forming process. And this yields Kornblith's grand synthesis. We can see that some class of beliefs tend to be epistemically prior and formulate the following reliabilist theory of justification. A is justified in believing that P, if and only if P is produced by a process that is reliable, both in the smaller class of relevant counterfactual situations introduced by the world and the potentially larger class of alternatives introduced by the subject's other beliefs. Kornblith feels that this, in fact, unifies the insights of the foundationalist and the coherentist together in a simple but effective theory of justification. And so, everything ends in a beautiful sunrise. However, we might want to contemplate Kornblith's reliance on counterfactuals introduced by beliefs that a subject has. He rightly seems to question whether or not the arguments on paper's thesis is correct in supposing that a belief can be justified based on inferences that one only counterfactually is capable of making. And yet he seems to show no hesitation in adopting an approach to reliability that suggests that our beliefs introduce relevant alternatives that are, in fact, to be factored in evaluating the reliability of our beliefs. We can't help but wonder, then, if he isn't trading the arguments on paper's thesis for the relevant alternatives on paper's thesis. How can we be sure when and to what extent our beliefs dictate relevant counterfactual situations for the purposes of evaluating the reliability of our beliefs?